Ahí estamos. Bueno, bienvenidos a todos. Este es el último evento del Academic Econ Week del Club de Economía de la Universidad del SEMA. Yo soy Diego Comincini, miembro líder del club, y hoy junto a Bautista Garrido, que se va a sumar ahora en breve, estaremos conversando con el profesor Oliver Hart. Gracias, muchas gracias a él por su presencia hoy. Y nada, les cuento un poco cómo será el formato. Vamos a arrancar con una hora aproximadamente de preguntas preparadas y luego pasaremos a preguntas de ustedes, preguntas de la gente. Así que siéntanse libres de preguntar lo que quieran mientras nosotros vamos charlando en esta hora. Ustedes pregunten en la parte de Q&A que se encuentra ahí abajo en el Zoom y nosotros luego iremos. Luego en la segunda parte, la última media hora más o menos, Bautista irá leyendo esas preguntas para, para así cerrar el evento. Dicho esto, a partir de ahora empezamos toda la charla en inglés. Now we switch to English. We're in presence of Professor Oliver Hart. It's a great pleasure for us to have him in, in our club. I present Professor Hart shortly. He has a PhD in economics for the University of Princeton. He's professor Louis P. and Linda L. Geyser at Harvard. He was laureated with the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2016 for his contributions on contract theory, in particular with incomplete information contracts. He has that he has an amazing contribution to that matter and with relation to other subjects of the life like law, entrepreneur. So that's interesting for us to having him today. He's distinguished member of the American Economic Association and the Econometric Society. So, Professor Hart, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you, Diego.
Thank you for being here today. And something that I didn't say, but you first study mathematics. Is that right?
Yes.
How how was that? What motivates you to study mathematics in first place?
Well, I was fairly good at it, and it just interested me. I was I guess I liked it from a very young age. You know,
Okay.
eight
Okay.
or nine, I was already interested in it, and of the subjects at school, it was the one that I was either best at or most interested in, some combination of the two. So and I wasn't, yeah, I guess also there was nothing else I particularly wanted to do at university at the time. So that's why I did it. The system in the UK then and now is that you specialize at university. So I did mathematics at Cambridge University, and it's a 3-year degree. That's the norm in the United Kingdom, and you just do one subject. So I did 3 years of mathematics, nothing else, basically.
Uh, okay. Do you remember any particular professor or any story that you have related to mathematics in your path, in your early path?
Well, I remember it began to bore me after a while. Not there was First of all, at Cambridge, there was a lot of so-called applied mathematics, which was, maybe fluid dynamics or something like that. I was totally uninterested in that. There were a lot of differential equations, very complicated. It didn't excite me. And the way it was taught was extremely boring. Um, Theorem proof, theorem proof, theorem proof. There was no um, history. No discussion of when these things had been established. It could have been last week or, 500 years before. I had no idea. It was taught in a very dry way.
Oh, okay. It was something that then became 40. So said that when you discover the economy as something interesting in your life, it's that you got bored of mathematics and then you discovered economics, and how was that process?
The process was actually quite simple. Towards the end of my 3 years at Cambridge, the question was, what was I going to do next? This was, some time ago. It was 1969. It was a time of radical student activity. I was quite left wing at the time. I didn't want to get a job in industry. I didn't want to get a real job. And so, it seemed like the best thing was to do further study. But I knew that I wasn't nearly good enough to be a professional mathematician, nor uh, at that point did I have any desire to do that. So the question was, um, would I find something to apply my mathematics to? And people in Cambridge at the time told me, it's being used a lot in economics. And economics was a subject I knew nothing about, but um, I felt I should, not least because in political arguments, I used to argue with people a lot. I still do, actually, but in a slightly different way. At the time, I was frustrated because at some point in the argument, they brought up some economic consideration, and I was out of my depth. I didn't understand, what they were talking about. Of course, I'm quite sure they didn't understand it either, but that I didn't know that at the time. So the combination of applying mathematics to something and the desire to know some more about it. It's that combination that led me to study economics. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a great a great path. So then you started working on contracts, but I have when I was reading your history, I asked myself, when you get interested in contracts, why the information in contracts must be, well, incomplete, or why those things um, get care with you?
Yeah. Well, actually, I didn't get interested in contracts for a long time. I started off in economics. I did I mean, first excuse me, I got a master's degree at Warwick University in the UK. That was a transition. I mean, I didn't know any economics, so I did it was a graduate degree, but I spent the first year, it was a 1 year degree, but I did it in 2 years because the first year I was learning, I was catching up. And then the second year was the main thing. Then I went to Princeton, and that's where I did my PhD. And my initial interest was in general equilibrium theory, which was very popular at the time and was what more mathematical people did. And I liked that. I started working on that. And over time, um, I got interested in the, so part of general equilibrium theory is about firms, right? There's firms, there's consumers, and the firms are a bit of a black box. They're just assumed to maximize profit in general equilibrium theory. And I was interested, like others at the time, in sort of opening the black box and understanding um, eventually how managers make decisions. And to cut a long story short, I mean, I did some work in corporate finance, um, how firms are financed, but then I sort of got interested in. I realized the key thing, or one key thing to study was the uh, relationship between the shareholders of a firm and the managers. So one wanted to know. Um, I was still taking the view at that time that shareholders want firms to maximize profit, but then the managers might have their own goals. Um, and they might not want to work very hard, or they might the empire builders, or who knows. They have, this is what's called the principal agent problem. And to study that, you have to, it's all about contracts. It's the optimal contract between the owners of a company and the managers who run it. So, um, so the sequence was general equilibrium theory, studying the firm, and then principal agent theory, and that was the beginning of my um, serious interest in contracts. Now then, um, I'll just say one other thing, then you can ask another question. It's not really about incomplete information; it's about incomplete contracts. I eventually, um, so having studied the principal agent problem, which is the optimal contract between an owner and a manager to get the manager to act on behalf of the owner. How do you incentivize the manager, right? That's what that's all about. Um, I was led to consider a somewhat different question, was about the boundaries of the firm. And in particular, this old question that really started with the work of Ronald Coase in the 1930s, which is why do we have firms at all? And because in fact, in the simplest economic models, you just have individuals um, trading with each other through markets, and then yes, you have these firms. They're just production sets. They don't have any. Nothing's going on in them really. That's the black box. Okay, so once you start opening the black box, as I say, the first thing was to understand um, the incentive problem between owners and managers. But then the second thing was to understand the extent of firms. So, and that led to, when you start studying that, you're led to what economists call the make or buy decision, which is um, firm A needs some input. It can either get it from firm B, or it can make it itself inside firm A. How does it decide between those two? Okay. And the reason that's about the boundaries of the firm, because if firm A contracts with if it wants it from firm B, it will write a contract with firm B, right?
Yes.
Um, if it decides to do it itself, then it's going to have its own employees make it. But actually, that's another kind of contract. This time it has contracts with its employees. So what's the difference? That was this long-standing question, and that was the next thing I worked on. And that's where it turns out the key to understand the difference is to recognize that in both situations, the contracts are going to be incomplete. I can say more about what that means, but that was the sequence again, going from principal agent theory, which is just the owners and a manager, to the next step, which is whether you have two firms linked by contract or whether the transaction takes place under the umbrella of a single firm.
Okay. Well, great, great cycle. So, well, we can continue with why the contracts were incomplete and how do you manage to get to the idea to solve it?
Yes, we can continue. Would you like me to continue with that?
Of course, of course. Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, I will continue with that then. The answer is why are they incomplete? They're incomplete because we're talking here the all the interesting cases where a firm is deciding whether to outsource an activity. That's the same as a contract with another firm. Okay. I have, um, let's take the case of, um, I'm trying to think of it. Well, it could be, Trying to think of a good example for us. Um, it could be um, health benefits.
Okay.
Okay, you need some, your workers need, this is true definitely in the United States, your workers need health benefits, right? And you can have some outside company that you contract with to handle all of that, or you can do it inside your company, all right, with your own workers, arranging the health benefits of the other workers. This is the choice you have. Now, okay, in a situation like that, we're not talking about a short-term transaction. We're talking about a transaction that goes on for many years. Okay, so that's the first thing to consider. That creates a difficulty because when you write let's suppose you're going to do it by contract. So you have an outside firm that's going to do this for you, okay? Um, you sit down with them and you write a contract. Well, it's going to be for several years, maybe many years, okay? Let's say
Okay.
10 years. Things can happen during the course of that 10 years that are very hard to predict at the time when you write the contract. That's just the nature of things. The world changes, stuff happens, and the ideal contract would anticipate the many things that can happen and would have what, again, economists or lawyers would call contingent clauses. The contract would say, if this happens, we'll do this. If that happens, we'll do something else. I mean, an obvious example of an event that people didn't anticipate, or most people did not anticipate, was the pandemic. Um, but it's only one example of many. But the point is that the ideal contract would, the parties would have said to themselves, well, you know what? 3 years from now, maybe there's going to be a pandemic, right? Maybe there's going to be that. We don't know, but it's possible. So let's put in a clause how what we do together is going to change if a pandemic occurs. So we're going to have a whole part of the contract which will deal with that contingency. All right. That would be an ideal contract, but that's very hard to do because there's so many possibilities, so many things can happen. So people are unable to do that. So instead, the contract they write, it's going to have a lot of clauses in it, but it's going to have a lot of stuff left out. That's the sense in which it's incomplete. So the main reason for contractual incompleteness is the difficulty of anticipating the future.
Oh, okay. So, how do you solve it? How do you incorporate or adapt to the
Yeah.
contract's incompleteness of itself?
Yes. That is an excellent question. And that's and my thinking on that has actually evolved over time. So um, initially, people writing in this literature argued that the solution was to do things in-house. So basically, Coase, who I've mentioned, Ronald Coase, who was a British economist, who I think was born in about 1910 and wrote this famous paper um, called The Nature of the Firm. Have you read it?
I not complete, but we have this seen in class in microeconomics too.
Okay, he's known mainly for two things, the nature of the firm and something called the Coase theorem, so the nature of the firm, um, that was published in 1937. He was only 27 at the time, but actually he had the idea when he was still an undergraduate at the London School of Economics. So really your age. So I hope you're having ideas like that right now. Uh, anyway, it took him a while to publish it. But anyway, he was the first person who really raised this question. What's the difference between doing it inside the firm and with another firm by contract? Okay, later contributors included um, Oliver Williamson in the 70s, and their argument was, let me paraphrase it. It was, yes, if you tried to do it between two firms, because of this uncertain future and the difficulty anticipating things, it's going to be a bit of a mess. Um, and specifically, what they argued was that let's suppose we have this contract, then the pandemic occurs, right, with this unexpected event. And now we have to revise what we want to do. It's no longer appropriate to just do what the contract says because the world has changed. So we have to renegotiate the contract. And they argued that this could be a very costly process and it could take a lot of time and resources and it's going to be okay. And so they said, well, look, a way to avoid that is for you to do the whole transaction inside one firm, because then when some unexpected event occurs, you can just, and you need the service you're getting to change. You just tell the workers in your firm, previously you were doing X, now we want you to do Y. And they'll just do it. And that way there's no argument and it's all smooth. And this is the great benefit of what economists call vertical integration, which is when um, a buyer purchases its supplier. Okay, so that was
Yes.
their argument. So, in other words, their answer to your question was integration, moving the boundaries so that everything's happening within one firm. Now, when I started working on this in the 1980s, and this was with initially with Sanford Grossman, who's an economist who was at the University of Chicago at the time, later became a very successful hedge fund manager, but that's a different story. Um, I started the work with him, and then later I continued the work with John Moore, who's a British academic. Um, first of all, one thing we did, which was different from the previous literature, is we wrote down a formal model. So the previous contributors to this literature, Coase and Williamson, um, they were it was entirely verbal reasoning, words, and we were more modern economic theorists, and we wanted to be more formal about it. So that was one thing that we did. And what we well, I'm going to mention two things that were in our work that wasn't in the previous work. The first was we rather disagreed with this idea that you can just order people around.
Okay.
So, because after all, there's something to it, but it doesn't go that far because, suppose I tell you, Diego, you're currently doing X, but now I want you to do Y because the world has changed. Um, you might say, well, you know what? I don't want to work here anymore if I'm doing. An example would be actually um, in the pandemic. Suppose I said you had to get a COVID test every week.
Oh,
You
this
might say, I don't want to do that. And you might quit. Or to take another example, also based on the pandemic, um, now that the pandemic is over, during it, I said you could work at home, Diego. Now I say you've got to come back to the office 5 days a week. Okay, it's an order. And firms do that. But the thing is, it's an order, but you can always say no and quit. So the idea that a firm has control over the human capital of its workers is a is a bit extreme. So actually, what my co-authors and I did was we emphasized something different. We emphasized that what you have control over is the physical assets, not the human assets of the company that you're running or that you own. So that um, if I buy your company, let's suppose you're the manager, you're the owner manager of a company that was supplying me. All right. And
Correct.
now I decide to integrate by buying your company. Okay. In our work, we said it's not that I can now tell you what to do, it's that I have control over the physical assets of your company. We actually called it, we actually said that I have control over all those aspects of the physical assets which have not been specified in a contract. So we call these residual control rights. So just as any contract is incomplete because of the difficulty of anticipating the future, that's also going to be true of the physical assets you work with. It could be some sort of machine or some facility, a building. It could there are lots of physical assets. I mean, the land, um, um, patents, copyright, software. Okay, all interesting firms consist of human capital and what we call non-human capital. Okay, and the point is, once I become the owner, I have the right to decide on how these things should be used unless a prior contract has specified how they are to be used. So, as I say, we call these residual control rights. But for our purposes, we can just think of them as control. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, what it means is that let's go back to this case where, um, by the way, there's some work going on in my house. I don't know whether you can hear it.
No, no, there's no problem.
Oh,
We cannot
okay,
hear it,
because
so
I
no.
can hear it. It's sort of them working away. But anyway, I can hear you, and as long as you can hear me, that's okay. So, what we said is when I if I do the if I buy your company ahead of time, then it's not previously, the contract said X, you would do X, right? Now I want to change it to Y. I can't just order that. But what I can do is I can say to you, now you were the owner manager of this company. Now I bought the company and I kept you on as the manager, okay? Um, I could suggest you do Y, and you could always say, no, I'm quitting. But if you do that, I can replace you with somebody else because the assets, the physical assets belong to me. In other words, I can say, you have to leave the building, and I'll put DAO number two in the building who's willing to do Y, right?
Yes.
Previously, I couldn't do that because when we were separate companies, in order to replace you, I would have had to replace the building as well, all the assets, because you control them, right? So it's much more costly when we're two separate companies. If I want to terminate the contract, I have to find not only a replacement for you, but also a replacement for all the other non-human assets that are important. A completely different situation. So that was, in a way, our contribution. But we also added something else, which was we argued that if if I buy your company, I now have I'm in a now a more powerful negotiating position with you later on if something unexpected happens and we have to revise the contract because I always have the ability to get rid of you and replace you, right? I have that power
Yes.
now, which can be good for me, but it's completely symmetric. It's the opposite is true for you. You now have less power because previously I couldn't replace you so easily. And so I've gained power, but you've lost power. And that sometimes can be bad. That can actually be overall a bad thing. In other words, it can be the case that you losing power is more important than me gaining power. I'll give you an example of how this could work. Suppose you're thinking, um, we're starting this relationship and I bought your company, so you're now an employee of mine. You're the manager of this other, the company I bought, but you aren't the owner anymore. Okay. So suppose you were thinking of devoting yourself, in the next 2 years to really figure out how to make um, the division. You're now a division of my company, to make your division more efficient. Okay.
Yes.
So you're going to put in a lot of effort, including at night. Instead of watching television, you would be spending your time thinking about what you can do to make it even more efficient. Okay. After 2 years, you've done your work. And I say to you at that point, well, Diego, that's great. Thank you so much. Goodbye. I now have your idea and I'm going to implement it myself with your replacement. I don't really need you anymore. And so that might mean you don't get the benefit of this idea. And therefore, anticipating this, you decide, you know what, I'm going to watch TV. I'm not going to spend all my time because I don't have job security. Whereas previously, when you were the owner of the company, um, because I couldn't replace you, you were in a much stronger bargaining position. You could get the benefits of your ideas, and you would have a bigger incentive to have ideas in the first place, to devote the time to having them. So, bottom line, integration, I'm using this as a short, integration is the word we use when company A buys company B and all the operations take place under the umbrella of one firm. Okay, that's sometimes I call it vertical integration, sometimes just integration. The point of my work in this area with co-authors was it has costs as well as benefits. It's all, which is something that the previous Coase and Williamson really didn't emphasize at all. It was all about the benefits. They never really saw that there was the other side to all of this. Okay, so that's what okay, I think I'll pause there so that you can ask another question. But that was my now, but my thing. I'll just go on to say that in the last few years, my thinking has changed a bit, quite a bit actually.
Well, we can discuss about that changes. It's related to your interest in behavioral, more the behavioral
Yes,
of person.
it is. It is. It's in because over time I got somewhat dissatisfied with the um, remember I told you that what I was doing again with co-authors that was different from what went before was um, writing down formal models. But the thing about this was that eventually the formal models that we were working with didn't really seem to be quite right. I didn't think they were really capturing the essence of what was going on. Um, and that led me to introduce some behavioral features. And I started working on the idea that um, people can get angry. That one of the purposes of a contract is it's not just the classic idea of a contract is it's a set of obligations. I agree to do X in return for you doing Y. Okay. Um, we agree you're going to supply me with some steel, and I, the contract says you will supply this much steel, and I agree to pay you that much. So that's, you have the obligation to supply, I have the obligation to pay. Okay. That's the classic view of a contract. I started to work with the idea that not that that's wrong, but that the contract has another role as well, which is as a reference point. So that the idea there is that once we've agreed to something, and the simplest way to think of it is suppose we haven't decided yet what the price of the steel is going to be. For
Okay.
various reasons, we don't want to pin it down yet, but we decide it's going to be between 20 and $100 per, I don't know,
Sí.
whatever weight of steel. So we're willing to, we know it should be in that range, but we don't want to say 30 or 90 yet because okay. So so far we haven't actually obligated ourselves to anything because we haven't said, what we've said is we're going to decide the price later, but we've agreed it'll be between 20 and 100. Now, some people would say that's totally meaningless because I could later, I could say, let's suppose I'm the buyer. I could say, I want to pay 10. And you're going to say, well, wait a minute, we agreed to between 20 and 100. I'll say, well, I don't, then the contract's off as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to start again because we haven't agreed any price between 20 and 100, which means we've agreed on nothing, which means I can just ignore it and try to insist on a price of 10. Equally, you could say you want a price of 130. Okay, that's one view. I think it's an incorrect view of the way people behave. I think that in fact what's going to happen is because we've agreed on this range, further negotiation will take place within this range. In other words, and if it didn't, so let's keep going. Suppose I did insist on a price of 10.
Okay.
One of the things you would do, first of all, I think you would be outraged. And even if you either you would refuse and the whole deal would be off, or if you did agree to a price of 10, I would not get it would not be a happy relationship. So you would find some way to get back at me, lower quality, something. You wouldn't be helpful. Next time I want a favor from you, you'd laugh. Are you kidding? After that kind of, right. So that, yes, I conceivably I could get it for 10, but it would be not the thing I want anymore. So, okay, this was part of my work with John Moore published in 2008, called Contracts as Reference Points. So basically, our idea was that um, if that people can get angry with each other, in my example, because we go outside the range that we had agreed on, and when they get angry, they retaliate. We call this shading behavior. They punish the other party by reducing the quality or doing something which is not easy to verify. It's not like I can then sue you for breach of contract. It's sort of hidden stuff. It's stuff which is not very it's not verifiable to outsiders. But I certainly am going to feel the impact of it. And so, okay, so this is a different way of looking at things, and it's led me. Okay, so now I can continue the story because actually this is an interesting story. I'd done
No,
that
continue.
work, unless you want to
No,
interrupt.
let's continue. Let's
All
continue.
right. Okay, we'll continue because it turns out, I would say, um, that paper was published in 2008. Okay, so in 2016, I was lucky enough to win the Nobel Prize for my work in contracts. Now, it was mainly for the earlier work. There was a little mention of this recent work, but it was not played up very much. And I would say at that time, and I fear still today, this more behavioral stuff is hasn't had the success of the earlier stuff as far as economists are concerned. However, I think economists are wrong about this. I think this behavioral stuff is actually uh, pretty important. And now I'm going to lead you into my story. So, when you win the Nobel Prize, you go to Stockholm for a week, the Nobel Week. It's a most amazing event. Um, and it's packed with activities. It's totally overwhelming and exhausting. One of the things that, I mean, there are official activities all the time, but you also get invited um, to non-official things. So people, in Stockholm, companies invite you to come and talk to them, and students and student groups and all sorts of things, most of which you don't have time for or you don't want to do. But there was one invitation I got, which looked interesting. It was from a law firm, and I thought, you know, these guys know about contracts, so I will go and talk to them. So I went there, and um, the person who invited me, who's somebody called David Friedlinger, okay, he listened to my talk as the others did, and at the end he told me, "Wow, I really the thing that I find most interesting is the stuff on contracts as reference points." Um, it turned out that really resonated with him. He's a practicing lawyer who whose day job is writing advising his clients on contracts. And it turns out that he was using an approach called, well, it has various names, but basically it's using guiding principles. I'll come to it in a moment. I'll describe it in a bit more detail. But he was using an approach in practice, which he'd found worked extremely well, but he didn't quite know why. And he realized my work provided a foundation for what he was doing, a theoretical foundation. And of course, I was very interested to find out something that my work could be applied to. So anyway, we teamed up. And since that time, we've written a couple of principal of main papers together. Um, and some smaller things. But the two main ones are one which was also with a third person who has worked with him called Kate Vitasek. So the three of us wrote a paper called A New Approach to Contracts, which was published in the Harvard Business Review in 2019. And then David and I have a more academic paper called Overcoming Contractual Incompleteness, the Role of Guiding Principles. And that is published in the Journal of Law, Economics and Organization in 2024. These things can be found on my website.
Okay.
Um, Although I think you may have difficulty getting access to the Harvard Business Review one, but I'm not sure. They're very proprietorial about these things, but the other one is certainly downloadable. Okay, the point of this, so what's the idea? Let's take the second paper, the title, Overcoming Contractual Incompleteness, the Role of Guiding Principles. So what the basic idea behind this paper, and this is how my views have changed, because I no longer think that integration is necessarily the solution to our problems, or the problems of contractual incompleteness, because even under integration, you still have these employees and your contracts with them are going to be incomplete. So it doesn't really solve the problem. It just shifts the problem. So the way this guiding principle approach works is to say, I'm going to do it for the case of two firms, but it could be inside a firm as well. So you have two firms, and I'm going to give an example of it in a moment because we've studied cases. Well, he has lots of cases because he uses it, but in the article, we also mentioned some cases where this approach has been used. The basic idea is the two of us sit down, right? I'm firm A, you're firm B. Um, we're going to have a relationship with each other, an economic relationship lasting for several years. The first thing is we recognize that we can't write a perfect contract. We're going to have an incomplete contract because the future is uncertain. Okay. Instead of trying to put in as much as possible into the contract, have the lawyers think of as many things that could happen as they can and put those things into the contract. We don't do that because that is never going to work really well because there's always going to be stuff left out. So instead, we put some things in the contract, but then we agree on some guiding principles that we will use to fill in the gaps. In other words, when some unforeseen event occurs and we have to revise what we're doing, instead of getting into some sort of oppositional, conflictual renegotiation, we're going to use guiding principles to decide what we should do. And the whole purpose is to reach an outcome that both of us feel is fair
Okay.
so that neither of us feels upset and starts retaliating against the other. That's the purpose of this. And there are six guiding principles, and they're going to sound to an economist, they do sound to an economist a bit kind of flaky, um, but I'll tell you what they are. They are honesty, in no particular order. Actually, I normally start with loyalty, equity, honesty, integrity, autonomy, and reciprocity. And these principles are actually one of the things about them is that they are all, um, in effect, norms that we're familiar with. And so they're not sort of they're familiar, not unfamiliar things. And therefore, we think of agreeing on them as we're kind of activating norms that we already are in our brain. But the point is, we've agreed in a kind of solemn way to apply them to our relationship. Um, and okay, it's not just, we don't just write them down. They're part of the formal contract. So the formal contract is going to consist of some standard things like the price, the quantity, a bunch of things that you would normally see in a contract. But then a lot of the other details are going to be left out. And instead, we're going to have these guiding principles that we're going to use to fill out the contract. Now, that's not all. We we don't just write them down. We talk about what they mean. And we also talk about what we're trying to achieve from our economic relationship. So this is another difference from the way lawyers think about it, but it's actually music to the ears of economists because what it's saying is that when we get together, we say to each other, look, the reason we're doing this is because there's some surplus that we can create. And that's what, so we're going to talk about how to maximize that and divide it in a reasonable way. So no zero sum thinking. Well, this is positive sum thinking. And so actually we spend some time talking about what we're hoping to achieve from this relationship, what our vision is. And then we agree to these guiding principles, and we also agree to communication mechanisms. So one of the things about this approach is that we agree to talk to each other throughout the relationship. And um, because we've agreed to honesty and integrity, one of the side products of that is suppose I see something coming down. You're the supplier, let's say. So it's you're supplying something to me. Um, Suppose you realize, you know what, one of your suppliers might not be able to deliver something which might cause a problem for you delivering to me. Then, in the old days with a standard contract, you might have hidden that or certainly not
Yes.
told me about it because you would hope it would go away, you'd resolve it, right? But now you are under some obligation because you've agreed to do it. It's not that I can sue you, but you've agreed to be honest. And so you'll come to me ahead of time and explain why there might be this problem. And that allows me to prepare. And if there is a problem, we're going to resolve it in a way using these guided principles that is fair to both of us. And that's going to keep us on the same page throughout the relationship and avoid any, as I say, negative activities um, on either side. So this is the approach I now actually. My thinking then has changed somewhat. I think that incompleteness of the contract is fundamental. And if you ever talk to people who write contracts, and I've talked to a lot of them, um, they all agree with that. Um, and then the question is what to do about it. And I think this approach is a good way of dealing with it. But it's still early days because, I would like more people to be using it. We have to see um, whether we have widespread success with it.
Okay. Well, so it extended a lot, but it takes too much interesting points. So related to law, how do you manage that? How do you deal with judges, with lawyers, with those that environment? In how as an economist, as a mathematician, you explain to them what you can contribute to and them to you.
Yes, good question. I would say I've learned a lot from lawyers. So one of the ways my work changed and improved was um, talking to them. So, I started off working on contracts, I would say, in the late 1970s. And initially, I was doing it just as an economic theorist. So, sort of sitting in my office and scribbling things on the blackboard, as it was then, or on a pad of paper. Um, with co-authors, of course, they in some cases knew more about the world than I did. But the thing is, it was more rather abstract. Okay, and I think one of the benefits in the early 1980s, I started talking to lawyers, and when I moved from um, the UK to the US, I was near Harvard Law School. First, I was at MIT, and then I moved to Harvard. So then Harvard Law School, now they are my colleagues, although, not in the economics department, but I have a lot to do with them. And more generally, from the early 80s, I started hanging out. I went to conferences of law and economics people. And I would say I learned a lot about the institutions um, and also how they think about it, which is different from the way economists think about it. And I think the truth is a combination of the two. So I certainly think that I've absorbed some of their thinking into my work and it's improved it. And I also have learned, this was a big thing, that if you want them to understand what you're doing, you have to communicate, you have to use the simple language. Not that they're very smart people, but they don't do models. Most of them, some of them do. But if you want to talk to a lot of them, then you have to recognize that most of them are not trained to think, use mathematics. And so either you have to use numbers, numerical examples, or words. And the thing is, what you realize is they could, I mean, you can do it. It's actually, it's a very good um, discipline for you to translate what you're doing into stuff which is comprehensible to them. Because if you can't do it, it probably means that what you're doing isn't very good. You know,
Okay.
that is, I mean, I feel that is a actually a serious problem with a lot of modern economic theory that that somebody's up there doing all sorts of complicated mathematical things, and when you ask them, as I do, I think, could you please give a simple example of this or something so I can really understand what's going on? They can't do it, which is astonishing. And actually, what it means is they don't really understand what they're doing themselves. So I think if you can't explain something simply, you probably haven't understood it. It doesn't mean that everything is simple. So models are very important, and sometimes they can get quite complicated. And I'm not saying that the complexity is unnecessary. What I'm saying is at the end of it, you ought to be able to distill the essence and make it comprehensible with some, as I say, I like a simple example, okay?
Okay.
So that
Yes.
anybody can understand it. Anybody with any sort of analytical, I mean, lawyers are analytical. It's just they are not, let's say, mathematical. So they want to see a simple example of it. And so I was forced, once I started being part of that community, to communicate that way. And it's improved my thinking, my writing, my work.
It's like a frame as a teacher, of course, also
Yeah.
like a everyday teacher. So,
Yeah.
Professor Hart, the people were asking. We got some questions from Instagram, and the people asked the time that you have won the Nobel Prize. Were you expecting it? How was it?
Um, you can never expect something like that. I thought I had a reasonable chance. The honest truth is that I feel less deserving now than I did before I won it. As time passes, I wonder, why did they give it to me? But at the time, I thought, and this is what, a lot of people, I think, pretend otherwise. When they say, when they win and they're asked about it, they say, "Oh, I never thought it was a total surprise." I find that I don't believe it almost all the time, certainly in economics, because the people who win are people, on my list of people who might win, and it seems inconceivable they wouldn't have thought of that themselves because, people do say to you, "Oh, I think you're going to win," not anybody official, but, friends. So the honest truth is I thought I had a chance, but I wouldn't go any further than that. I didn't actually think it was, when it happened, it was amazing.
Oh, that moment, that call. Where were
Yeah.
you? What were you
I was in
doing?
bed. I was in bed because it was 2 minutes past 5 a.m. So not surprisingly, I was not up.
Oh,
My wife
incredible.
my wife picked up the phone and handed it to me. Yeah.
And some Swedish guy were talking to you. And and that one interesting question that we have received from some Valentini Ibarra is a student here is how do you receive the payment of the Nobel Prize? Is a bank transfer in Swedish crowns? Is in dollars? What do you use it for?
No, they just hand you a bag of gold. No, they don't. It's a yeah, bank transfer.
Okay, okay. Oh, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, professor. Now, at your age and your stage in life, what you can say about to be a great professional, a great academics? Many of us students want to be academics in the future. We want to do papers, investigation, and apply it on life. So, what advice can you give to us?
Well, I mean, the first thing is being an academic is not for everybody, okay? I mean, some people these days, a lot of young people they may be very smart, they may be very good at economics, and they decide, I'm going to go and work in a hedge fund or a um, private equity or this or, an investment bank or for a AI or this or who knows, the private sector. A lot of people do that these days, and that seems to be something that um, they enjoy. They want to do. I would never have. I never wanted to do that. Um, I don't think I would have been any good at it. Um, I was lucky that I ended up doing something that I could do pretty well. But I've seen now I've been in this game for quite a long time. I see people, some of whom very talented. They start off as researchers and then they stop. So I would say to be a successful academic researcher, you have to have certain characteristics. I think you have to be um, in love with ideas. So you want to have an idea, a good idea. Ideas are very important to you, and you want to have good ones. You have to be very passionate about this, very determined, um, willing to work hard and keep pushing for an idea, or if you have an idea, pushing it. You have to be willing to do that, even when things are tough, because it's not necessarily a smooth path. It certainly wasn't for me. You have downs as well as ups. It can be tough because if you do something which is somewhat novel, I mean, it's not necessarily going to be accepted by other people right away, and it may be criticized. And in my case, some of the criticisms were justified, and so I had to kind of revise what I was doing and so on. And um, that can be quite a lonely activity. In fact, that more generally, research, academic research, um, certainly if you do by yourself, is very lonely. But it's one of the reasons I like to work with co-authors, and I've done that for many years because there's someone to share. Well, the main reason to work with a co-author is because um, you when their ideas are combined with your ideas, you get something better than both. That is the main reason. But there's a secondary reason, which is that you can comfort each other when things aren't going well, or when, you know, your article is rejected, or someone criticizes, your article's accepted, but then someone writes a criticism of it, or people don't seem as interested in it as that you think they should, and all that sort of thing. You have someone to share that with, just as you can share the success with them too. Um, these days, I look at papers; they have multiple co-authors. It's things have really changed, and that's of course because the work has become very empirical, and now there seem to be 20 people who are in part of the project. It's more like science, so I don't understand that very well, but I think what I'm saying is that so compared to, let's say, being a lawyer, suppose you were working in a law firm. Um, I mean, the work's intense, but it's collaborative. And also, um, you get you see how I mean, you get praise, or it goes well or it goes badly. It's sort of every day you get some idea of it's not a long-term project, right? You're working on a case and it's already intense, and then either the case is settled or you win or you lose, and then you work on the next one. Um, the gains and the losses are earned relatively fast. In the case of academic work, we're talking about much more long run things. So you might write an article. Um, let's take my probably my most cited article was published in 1986. I won the Nobel Prize in 30 years later. You know,
Yeah.
that's a long lag, right? I mean, compare it to. Let me give you another example. Think of making a movie. You make a movie in 2026, and you either win the Oscar in 2026 or you don't win it, right? You don't win it 30 years later for that movie. It's completely now, of course, you could get a lifetime Oscar award 30 years later, but that's a bit different. That's what the Nobel Prize is. But I'm just picking the Nobel as an example. The thing is more generally that the impact of that work, whether it's going to be how successful it's going to be, you won't be able to tell a year later or 2 years later or even 5 years later. It's going to take decades before you'll really be able to figure out, is that something that's for the ages, or is it was it kind of a temporary thing and people are going to forget it? Okay, so you have to have a kind of long run um, mentality, and you have to be very patient. and as I say, very determined. And not everybody has those. Some people want more immediate success or failure. Well, they don't want
Okay.
failure, but they want to be told more quickly. Good, bad, doesn't happen so much in
Right.
academia.
Want to be patient.
You have to be patient and determined and ambitious and but mainly determined. Just keep going.
Okay. And it takes a whole life, right? This a
Yeah.
mode of life
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, sometimes somebody has, of course, there are exceptions. Somebody might have some brilliant contribution when they're extremely young. I mean, look at, James Watson, who just died, who was one of the co-discoverers of DNA, along with Francis Crick, right? You know who I mean here, right?
Watson, yes. James Crick, I didn't know him.
Oh, you don't? Well,
No.
it was Watson and it was Crick and Watson. It was the two of them.
Oh,
Why do you know
well,
Watson? Just because he just died?
yes. It's
Okay,
recent
Crick
news.
Crick died some time ago. Anyway, okay, he's just as famous. But let's take Watson. Okay, he was DNA. They did the work. I think it was published in 52 or 53, 1950. He was 20 something at the time. Okay, he won the Nobel Prize in 1962, and we know, he just died at the age of 97. So do the math. If he was 97 in 2025, then in 1962, I think he was 34. Is that right?
Yes, yes. See, 34. See, or 35 with the birthday,
Yeah,
but
I think he was
the
34.
same.
Okay, that's very young to win a Nobel Prize. Okay, and um, he did more stuff after that, but it wasn't, of course, not in the same league. I mean, I think that was actually Crick, interestingly, as far as I know, Crick, I mean, Watson did quite a bit, but Crick actually probably had more imaginative, more original contributions after the big one. Let's take another example, John Nash. You're
Yes.
familiar with him. I mean, Nash, of course, he was a tragic case because he got schizophrenia. But he did these two amazing, he wrote these two amazing papers, Nash Equilibrium and Nash Bargaining, when he was very young. And and he did some other stuff in mathematics. And then he went not crazy, basically. I mean, he became mentally ill um, for a long time and then sort of recovered a bit. But so that can happen. Some people, but I think in economics these days, that's extremely unlikely. I think it's
Okay.
now we've reached the point in the field that contributions, some extraordinary contribution that you're going to be remembered for forever, when you're 25 or 35. I don't think so. It's more a solid, a lifetime
Okay.
of,
Yes.
of work.
Okay. Well, Professor, I was while you were talking, I was thinking of something that you have said of co-authors. So, but
Yeah.
personally for you, who was a true teammate? Who was a true co-worker with in your life as a great person that surprised you or that give you to the next level?
Well, we're talking about within economics, not my wife. She has been an important influence on me.
Yeah, that
We'll put that aside. Um, Although she was very important in um, helping me to learn how to write, which is a key skill, which I didn't have when I graduated from the University of Cambridge in mathematics. I was really my writing skills were pathetic at that time. But anyway, let's put that on one side. The I've been lucky in my career to have three superb co-authors. The first one was Sanford Grossman, who's a a genius, I think. Um, and I learned a great. He's actually younger than me. He was about nearly 5 years younger, um, but he was very precocious. I learned an enormous amount from him, um, and he made my work undoubtedly better. I mean, that was. I also learned. He was from Chicago. He was trained at Chicago, University of Chicago, and when I met him, I had my PhD from Princeton. I'd been um, teaching in the UK for a couple of years. I wasn't that familiar with the Chicago style of thinking. At that time, there was a Chicago style of thinking that was rather different. And that was one of the things I learned from him, but a lot more than that. Um, so I worked with him for several years. Then I started working with John Moore, and he's a brilliant mathematical economist, and that I think our papers were much better because he was a co-author of them. Um, and then recently, in the last um, 10 years or so, I've been working with Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago um, on a project we haven't really had time to talk about. Um, so as although I'm partly continuing with my work in incomplete contracts, that's very important to me. And as I say, this sort of stuff with practitioners, with Friedlinger and Vitasek on the guiding principles, that's something I hope to continue to work on. Um, but then I also have a new line of work on corporate social responsibility and shareholder democracy, and I've been doing that work with Luigi, and he's a fabulous co-author. We complement each other extremely well, um, and we're writing a book, which will be. We have several articles. You can find them on my website, but we also have a book, which is will be published, I think, in the spring of 2027. And it's been an absolute pleasure working with him on that.
Okay.
So I've been very lucky, very, very lucky with my co-authors.
Well, that's amazing. And closing with investigation, how do you approach your investigations that you have talked about quite a little bit, but it's like you you want to solve something and then you go to investigate and get to the answer, or it's the inverse process? Like you working on it and then you discover that you have the applications.
Um, I mean, I think in my early days, I was doing what a lot of people do, which was I was looking at the literature and saying, I was familiar with something there, and then I thought, well, what happens if you take that model and introduce a new feature or something? In other words, what I was doing was I was doing stuff kind of adjacent to the literature. Um, and in some cases, it worked out well because you find that when you slightly change what somebody is doing, something surprising happens. That can
Okay.
happen. And that happened to me actually in my PhD dissertation. Um, but in more recent years, I think it's been more about thinking that there's an interesting question that I don't know the answer to and kind of investigating it.
Okay.
Saying, can I figure out again, usually with a co-author, what's going on there, you know, can we understand that better? Now, when you do that, you may find that you end up somewhere else. So that is the thing is, I think one of the things about research is the kind of which is interesting and is the surprise factor, which is um, as I say, let's take this case. There's a question. You start investigating it, which the way I do with a co-author is I would start chatting with them about it. Do you think this is the answer? No, but that doesn't work because of this. What about this? No, that doesn't work. But what about that? And okay, it's a sort of dialogue. Sometimes writing down models and then realizing, no, that doesn't work. Seeing something, oh, no, that has a ridiculous implication. It can't be that. And then, okay, an iterative process. But then sometimes what you find through this process is you end up somewhere different and you
Okay.
actually answer a different question. You realize maybe the question you asked you were interested in wasn't well posed, or there's no answer really, it's a mess. But then you realize, but you know what? I think I've understood something else. Okay, so yeah, that's the way. I mean, it's a little difficult. I think the point is there is no, if I could give you a good answer, you do A followed by C, B followed by C. Well, then it would be kind of research. Then we'd get all the answers rather quickly. It doesn't work like that.
Okay.
You never know exactly how you're going to the extent that you ever get something interesting, the path to getting there is not well defined. Step one, followed by step two. So there's always, you have to just, there's luck. You change the direction, you see something unexpected. Talk about incomplete contracts. It's the things you can't anticipate, which make it both challenging, frustrating, because often there'll be periods where you have nothing, and but then exciting when if you're lucky enough to find something.
Okay. Well, a great path. It's an interesting way of life. So, Professor Hart, just to close the session, I have a personal question. Is have you been in Argentina?
Yes.
When? Do you like it? Where were you?
Um, I was there in 1999, some time ago then. Yes, I went for a trip. I gave a talk. Um, I was in Buenos Aires and um, then I went to okay, Izazu, no, what's it called? The falls, Brazil.
Ah, see the falls. It's all right in Brazil,
Yeah,
Paraguay, and
yeah,
north of Argentina.
yes, I went there. Um, that's the only time. I haven't been to much of Latin America, actually, interestingly. I've been to, it's kind of surprising because it's not that far away. I've been I've been to Brazil a couple of times, and I've been to, or maybe actually only once, come to think of it. Um, and I've been to Lima, Peru. Um, that's about it. Yeah.
Well, well,
Uh,
well.
there can
You
always
can
be another time. Yeah.
you can visit us
Yeah.
next year, maybe.
Yes.
We don't know. With the YPF contract process and the lawsuit in the US. So now we are in. Thank you very much, Professor Hart, for your time, your answers, and your experience. We are going to upload it to YouTube, and if you want to, I send you the link when this is end,
Sure.
and
Please
we see
do.
you. Okay.
Yeah, please do. I hope I didn't say, I'm trying to think, did I say anything that I regret? No, not really. I think it's okay. You can upload it. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
All
Now,
right.
if not, we cut off that part.
Yeah. No, it's
We're
okay.
okay.
All
Well,
right.
Professor, thank you very much. Have
Okay,
a good
Diego.
one.
All right.
And,
Thank you. All right. Have a good rest of the day,
and
weekend. Yeah. Bye-bye now.
bye bye. And al resto, muchas gracias por participar. Como dijimos, luego lo vamos a subir a YouTube. Y nada, esperemos que ande muy bien. Cerramos la Academic Econ Week con el gran Oliver Hart. Un abrazo grande a todos y muy feliz cierre de año. Que anden muy bien.